This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals participating in the show. All persons described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions along with adult language, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. In October of 1974, a man named Carl Higdon had a series of bizarre experiences while hunting elk in southern Wyoming. He was taken aboard a strange, transparent craft and literally dropped back down to earth in a state of utter confusion. Carl's case is significant not just for its fantastic account, but for the fact that it appears to have been a canceled disappearance. You're listening to the Mysterious Brews podcast, and tonight we bring you the case of Carl Higdon.
Went to pick up my crew to go to work, and one of them was sick, so we couldn't work. So I came back to the house and decided I'd go hunting. So I decided to go on down into the forest, and I hunted down there until, must have been around 4 o'clock. So I walked down over this hill. Whenever I got over the hill, I seen these 5 elk standing down there. One of them was a big bull, so I raised my gun to shoot.
Then something happened beyond his range of experience.
Welcome to a deep, dark, dank, moist, and sticky basement somewhere in the bowels of Georgia. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you live anywhere east of the Mississippi, it is a heat wave, and I'm sure it has gone probably west of the Mississippi too. We have temperatures of 99 with a heat index of 106. The sweat has sweat, I tell you. No new patrons this week, but hopefully you have, as patrons, checked out a new series, What If, that we have started and enjoyed our first maiden voyage on that series with What If Maura Murray is Alive. No 5-star reviews, but we will jump right into it. We're going back to Wyoming this week. Like I said in the opening, we are discussing Carl Higdon's bizarre abduction, and some believe it was an aborted disappearance. And the way that it was described as a canceled disappearance leads you to believe that some UFO abduction experiences kind of weave into the missing person cases and may have an underlying cause in our missing 411 cases. So in October of 1974, Carl Higdon was 40 years old and working as an oil driller for AM Well Service in Riverton, Wyoming. On Friday, October 25th, he had an unexpected day off. So, like any good redneck oil hand, he decided he was going to go elk hunting. So he packed his new, brand spanking new, shiny 7mm Magnum rifle and headed south towards McCarty Canyon. Now, McCarty is about 40 miles south of where he lived in the small titty. Woo, boys. That's a good one. Small city of Rawlins. They may have small titties out there. I don't know. During his drive, Carl pulled over to help 2 fellow hunters whose pickup would not start. Sharing coffee with the hunters, they told Carl that he would probably have better luck in the woods than in the open meadows. So Carl took their advice and headed toward the northern edge of Medicine Bow National Forest. If you know anything about Medicine Bow, there's some strange shit that has gone down in Medicine Bow. He parked his pickup on a hill and had a brief discussion with a Mr. Green Jeans, or a game warden, who happened to be there. Now, this was around 4 p.m., and Carl left the game warden and began his hunt. He walked less than a mile into the forest and arrived at a small clearing in the woods. He noticed 5 elk a few hundred feet away, all eerily still and not moving. Carl raises his rifle, looks at the largest male, and pulled the trigger. But to his surprise, there was no sound. And the bullet left the barrel in what he described as slow motion. The bullet stopped about 50 feet in front of him, basically hitting something invisible before dropping to the ground. What's even more odd is the elk never moved. They didn't flinch. And Carl noticed that the forest was unnaturally silent. So he goes over, picks his bullet up, and he notices a large, transparent, what he calls box, on the ground that was 5 feet high, 5 feet wide, and 7 feet long. It appeared to him to be made of glass and was empty inside. Carl's spidey senses started tingling, and he turned around to find a strange-looking humanoid floating upright before him. Now, this humanoid was wearing a black suit similar to that of a scuba diver. Carl would estimate that this being would be around 6 foot 2 inches tall and roughly weighed 180 pounds. Its skin was like that of what he called an East Asian person. And it had a similar face to a human's, but no chin, and a severely receded jaw. It had no eyebrows, no ears, and small slanted eyes. It did have hair, and he described that as coarse and straw-colored, and it stood straight out from the head like it would on a broom, like bristles on a broom. But it was kind of sparse. He said it was grouped into small bunches spaced roughly half-inch apart. There were 2 distinct rods coming from the top of this being's head that looked to be antennas. Now, the entity was wearing some black shoes and a wide belt with a 6-pointed star where the buckle would be, and a yellow symbol below it on a type of small apron. Its legs were noticeably bowed outward. It had no hands, but there were cone-shaped appendages, or what he described as possible devices, sticking out from its right sleeve. Carl referred to the being as a man, suggesting that it had some type of male characteristics. Now, this entity moved towards Carl by floating over top of the ground. When it got within a few feet of Carl, it asked him, quote, "Are you hungry?" Though Carl said it never moved its lips when it spoke. Carl replied in a positive, but, nod, I guess. And then the being produced a small envelope with 4 pills. And it floated these 4 pills towards him and told Carl to take one. Normally, Carl is a teetotaler and very reluctant to take any type of pill or medicine. But in this situation, he promptly swallowed one of it as if he was being controlled or manipulated. The entity then asked Carl if he wanted to go with it. And Carl, being the adventurer he is, he said, "Well, ain't got nothing better to do." Now, he said, quote, "I might as well." He did say that was his own expression, that it was not forced or felt like someone was talking for him. Now, he had read about UFO encounters in the past, and he had previously resolved to go with any UFO beings if he should ever encounter one. So this being pointed its cone-shaped appendage at Carl, and then suddenly he found himself elsewhere. Carl's next memory was of being inside the transparent rectangular box, but he said it seemed much larger on the inside than it looked on the outside. However, it was still in the forest. Carl said he was sitting in some sort of bucket seat and his arms and head were restrained. In the reflection of the glass above him, he could see 5 elk standing motionless in a cage. Now, the entity from the forest was in the room, and 2 more similar-looking beings were also in the room. Carl said, quote, "You've got my elk," end quote, and one of the beings just shrugged it off. He said that then the box lifted off the ground, and Carl looked down to see his truck where he had parked it, but the main being that he had interacted with waved its hand, and the truck just disappeared. Carl's next memory was seeing what he described as a blue ball or a huge marble, basically the earth, in the distance far, far below him. The beings told Carl that they were going home, which they said was roughly 163,000 light miles away. Then they put a helmet on him that had 6 wires sticking out in all directions and fastened a strap under his chin. Next, everything went black before a very bright light came on, causing Carl's eyes to burn and water. Carl, now standing in front of one of the transparent walls of the outermost structure, looking out into a giant featureless space with no visible walls or ceiling. The light was coming from the top of a tower that he likened to the Space Needle in Seattle, Washington, with lights rotating around the top. Below the tower, he could see several humans, adults and children, in casual discussion. 2 beings, with one being the one that Carl had met in the forest, took him down a long walkway toward the tower. This time, Carl was not walking, he was floating, just like the entities did in the forest. He was then led to a door that lifted up and taken inside a large room. While inside, there was a 4-foot by 8-foot, what he described as a wall or shield that dropped down in front of him, then lifted back up again into the ceiling. One of the beings then approached him and said, quote, "You're not what we want. We'll take you back," end quote. Carl then floated back out of the room, back into the bright light. Eyes burning again, and the beings told him that the sun affected them in the same way when they were on Earth. Carl was then floated inside of what he called a craft, where he encountered the being from the forest who now identified himself as Osso 1. And Osso explained that it too was a hunter, and that its kind had been coming to Earth for, quote, "many years in search of fish and animals," end quote. And they do so to make those food pills that he had given Carl. Each pill fed one person being for 4 days. Also went on to say that their ocean had turned yellow and that all their fish had died. Also then showed Carl a map of its planet, which was at least partially reproduced in the symbol on Osso's apron. It told him that the 9 planets of its solar system, quote unquote, supplied the magnetic force for their power. Also went on to explain and examine Higdon's or Carl's rifle. And he stated that it would look it would have liked to keep the primitive weapon, but he was not allowed to. Also told Carl that their kind wear black to protect them from their son. From our son. After the craft passed through what Carl described as a dark void, he could see that they had arrived over the forest. Also turned to Carl and said, "It will see him." I don't know what the hell that's supposed to mean, but that's what he said. And to his surprise, Carl then found himself floating down to the ground below the craft. Before landing, his foot slipped on a rock, causing him to fall and roll down the hill, hurting his shoulder. Carl followed a nearby road until he came upon his truck, but he didn't recognize it as his truck. He gets in, turns the truck on, and basically sits in the seat, and he hears voices on his CB radio. After figuring out how to use said CB, he connected with someone who turned out to be his boss, Roy Fleming. Fleming asked him for his location, but Carl was not able to give his name or his location. He just replied with, quote, "I don't know. I am so cold," end quote. He simply declared that he was in a pickup with a funny stick in the middle, despite having learned how to drive a stick shift as a child. It was around 6:30 p.m. when his boss, Roy, heard from Carl. Now, Carl's wife, Marjorie, had returned from work around 4 p.m. with a uneasy feeling, as she described it, and an urge to get to Carl. She was soon contacted and said, "Hey, he's made this sort of distress call on a CB." Carbon County Sheriff Charles Ogburn organized a search party that consisted of himself, Deputy Sheriff Ed Tierney, and 4 local hunters. Marjorie then called her friend Marilyn James, whose husband Don took them out in his truck to help search. Now, due to the muddy roads, the sheriff's team had great difficulty reaching the area where they suspected Carl's truck to be. Marjorie and her search party were told to stay on the hill and await further command. Now, Marjorie's friend Marilyn stated after they had received that command, she felt the truck move and looked up to see a quote-unquote moving star that was changing colors. So you've got Marjorie, Marilyn, and her husband all in this vehicle watching this changing color star for about 20 minutes. They said that it moved in a large arc, flashing brightly, switching colors from red to green to white. Now, the sheriff's search party announced that they had found Carl, and it was around 11:40 p.m. when they did so. His truck was found roughly 3 miles from where he had originally parked it, stuck in a mud hole with no tire tracks leading to the site. So while waiting for the searchers to return to the gate, the little search party with Marjorie and Marilyn and her husband, they noticed a big bright red orange light started rising to the east up above the horizon, which they took to be the sunrise. Then they realized, hey, it's almost midnight and we shouldn't be seeing that. So when they bring Carl out, Marjorie immediately notices that he was in a confused and almost amnesiac state. He had difficulty talking and at first did not recognize her. She tried speaking to him, but he only looked back as though he was looking through her, she stated. And someone in the group, I don't know if the sheriff or Marjorie, somebody asked if Carl had shot an elk. Carl looked up through the windshield and said, "They took my elk. They took my elk." But he didn't say it as normal. He said it in some sort of sing-song voice. Now, Carl was visibly shaking and stated that he was cold. So she tried to put her coat over his shoulders, but he winced and pulled back in a like fear state, crying, "Don't touch me." So on the drive to the Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlings, Carl asked why Fleming was dressed in black, and then said, "Doesn't the sun burn you?" Again, extremely odd. So when they arrived at the emergency room, and this was around 2 a.m., Carl, it was described that he wasn't crying, but his eyes were watering, quote unquote, profusely. And he said it was from the hospital lights. His shoulder was in pain, and he repeatedly asked for his pills that float to you. There was no bruises, no bleeding, no broken bones, nothing. They also ran a tox screen and found no drugs in his system. Now, Dr. R.C. Tongo determined that Carl was experiencing what is known as amnesic shock. When Marjorie asked him his name, he replied, quote, "They keep calling me Carl. Who is Carl?" End quote. During his time at the hospital, Carl would tell some of the elements of what he had experienced, but had trouble remembering all of it. So Marjorie gives him pencil and paper and just told him, whenever you remember something, just write it down. He drew a picture of this osso and then wrote the words in all caps, Enders, Enders. Now, the deputy sheriff later revealed that another man named Enders was in a different part of the forest that night. Carl also drew a forked road, a rough sketch of this transparent craft, listed 2 unidentifiable addresses, and made another note about his truck. Carl was released from the hospital on the morning of Monday, October the 28th. Now, the results of x-rays performed by Dr. Tongo found nothing of concern. However, years prior, Carl had x-rays taken that showed he had scar tissue on his lungs from a bout with tuberculosis. He also had several kidney stones before all of this went down. But, according to Dr. Tonko, when he performed these x-rays after Carl returned, he didn't see any of that. Now, Carl would experience headaches and pain in his back days after he was rescued. Now, Carl would speak to a reporter for the Daily Times of Rawlins named Sue Taylor, and he was still very mystified by his experience, confessing that he must be crazy. Now, Sue's article, which was the first on the case, appeared on Tuesday, October 29th. Now, Fleming would put Carl in touch with a local rehab counselor who in turn suggested that he speak with Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Same Dr. Leo Sprinkle from last week that we discussed in Pat McGuire's case. And remember, Dr. Sprinkle is a psychologist at the University of Wyoming who was interested in UFO experiences. So on November the 2nd, Dr. Sprinkle drove to Carl's home for the first of several regressive hypnosis sessions. Carl was able to put more pieces of the experience together, and Dr. Sprinkle invited a local art teacher to make a drawing of Osso 1. Now, Dr. Sprinkle went on to meet with Marilyn James, Sheriff Ogburn, Dr. Tonko, and Carl's nurse at the hospital, along with some members of the search party and several locals. Those who knew Carl said that they considered him honest and hardworking. Psychological and psychiatric tests at the University of Wyoming revealed no signs of mental illness. Now, one evening, Carl suggested to his wife, Marjorie, that they go out for a drive with their son. Carl drove a few miles south of town, taking a dirt road up a hill, seemingly knowing where he was going. Over 150 feet up in elevation, above where they're at, they see a bright green light shaped like a quote-unquote large upside-down ice cream cone. And they smelt a terrible odor of what was described as dirty socks mixed with sulfur. Carl then announced out of the blue, quote, "I'm late. I was to be here a few minutes earlier," end quote, and seemed kind of dismayed. A few nights later, Carl would wake Marjorie and say, quote, "I know it's weird. I'm in bed with you, yet I am out south of town. They are telling me to look for a black box," end quote. He felt that they were telling him that they could contact him whenever they wanted to. Now, this made Carl very uneasy and kind of triggered what can be described as PTSD along with pain in his shoulder. Several times on Carl's drive to and from work, he was followed by what he described as lights in the sky. And these were substantiated by other people that were behind him. Now, both Carl and Marjorie felt that their phones were being tapped. Carl claims that he still has telepathic communication with Osso on rare occasions. For example, Carl once told Osso that Rawlins needed some rain. The next day it rained 3 inches, then another 2 inches the following day. Before he told Osso to stop, the rain ceased. Now, Carl speculated that before shooting his rifle on the day of his abduction, I guess is what we can call it, that he entered some type of force field that slowed his bullet down. At one point, Carl, along with Don, Marilyn, and several others, returned to the location where this all transpired to take pictures and scan for metal, seeking to find the missing bullet. At the spot where the transparent box had sat, they noticed that nearby leaves were burnt and some trees in the area had strange, weathered-looking carvings in them. They did find the bullet, and it was examined by investigator Dr. Walter Walker, a metallurgy consultant for the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, or APRO. Now, Dr. Walker could only conclude that it hit something hard and it made it turn inside out. The bullet was also examined by a metallurgist at the University of Wyoming. Sometime after being sent to the university and having been looked at, it mysteriously disappears from the university's safe. So you have a TV crew for the old show In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy come to Rawlins, along with a Japanese film crew. The National Enquirer also arranged for Carl to take polygraph tests, which he passed several polygraph tests along the course of his life. Marjorie said she was compelled to write Carl's story decades prior to self-publishing the narrative in 2017 under the title Alien Abduction of the Wyoming Hunter. And this is how I found Carl's case. In 2022, David Pilatus made a Missing 411 documentary. I think it's the third one. The UFO Connection. In it, he actually interviews Carl and Marjorie. and compared the case's similarities to other disappearances in the same area. Now, Pilatus noted the significance of Carl being dropped at the end of the incident. This is consistent with hundreds of cases of unusual deaths that Pilatus has investigated where the recovered body appeared to be dropped from a distance above. The fact that there were apparently no tracks leading to this muddy spot where Carl's pickup was at suggests that it too was dropped. Now, researchers such as Linda Moulton Howe have documented that many cases of animal mutilation involve carcasses with broken legs, no surrounding tracks, and impacted soul, suggesting they also were dropped. Carl believes that some kind of medical examination occurred when that shield or that wall popped up in front of him and then dropped back down or went back up in the ceiling. And he feels like that was some kind of test and he failed it. And when he failed it, he was rejected due to that and the fact that the light hurt his eyes. Now, he would say that he felt like he was rejected because he had had a vasectomy. Now, Carl apparently healed from his lung scarring and his kidney stones while this medical procedure or scan happened. Preston Dennett has compiled over 300 cases involving spontaneous healing connected to a UFO or entity encounter. Dennett concludes that the beings in these encounters are advanced extraterrestrials, neither benevolent nor evil, healing people for reasons beyond just testing and experimentation. Now, there was a disappearance in the same forest that Carl was abducted from almost exactly 35 years later, and we covered this case back, and I'll have to look at the episode list to tell you which one, but it was Mark Anthony Strittmatter. And if you haven't listened to that, please do, but Reader's Digest version here. Strittmatter had 15 years of experience hunting in the region at the time he disappeared on October 19th, 2019. Similar to Carl, the spot where he disappeared from happened to be an area he had never hunted before. What's even stranger, at the conclusion of a prior hunt, Strittmatter saw a black UFO that followed him for a time. Also like Carl and many other missing persons, Strittmatter was of German ethnicity but never had a vasectomy. UFO researcher Jacques Vallée had noted that many historical encounters with fairies, elves, and other mythical creatures involve the experiencer being offered some type of food. In several such cases, people who cooperate with these beings are rewarded with an inexhaustible food supply. At the same time, there's an Irish tradition that holds or states that if you take food from the fairy world, you become a fairy yourself and you never return to the mortal realm. Could this kind of explain some of the missing 411 where the bodies are never found? That they go into this altered state, and once they do something in that altered state, other reality, they can't physically come back? Possibly. I mean, hell, nobody knows what's going on in that situation. Makes about as sense as any other theory I've heard. Now, there are many other UFO-related encounters on record that involved beings floating over the ground or moving in an unusual way. Remember, we also covered this case, the Pascagoula, Mississippi case. They floated out of their craft, and then a case that we will be covering soon, the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins case, they hovered over the ground, but they swayed their hips back and forth. Now, another unusual detail is the fact that Osso measured the distance from his planet to Earth in what he said were light miles rather than light years. Several UFO abduction experiences contain this weird discrepancy, like light miles versus light years. For example, the Italian abductee Pier Fortunato Zanfretta claimed that giant gilled aliens told him they came from the third galaxy, an extremely simplistic and astronomically meaningless description. Reading Carl's account, it's easy to speculate that he was meant to be taken away forever, but he became rejected or was rejected when they did this scan. In other words, you have some people that go missing under some weird ass experience or circumstances, and they're never seen again. So in Pilatus's Missing 411, the UFO connection, he kind of hints at maybe this is due to the same phenomenon that Carl experienced, but since he had had a vasectomy, he was no use of them. Because remember, there's this whole alien human hybrid thing, and there, most abductions, if it's a female, there's this long needle stuck through the navel, or there's an exam where they feel like they have taken eggs from them, and then if it's a male, there's a long needle, used to extract sperm. So whatever his reasoning was, Carl was rejected. And by being rejected, it may have saved his life, and he was not another missing 411 statistic. So this has been described as the Medicine Bow incident, the abduction in 1970s Wyoming. There were there was a lot of news articles written at the time of this. I think in one of them, Carl states that, quote, "Life is not the same since I met that man," end quote. So if you're interested, there is that book out there. I think you can find it on Amazon. This is a strange case, and kind of correlates to last week's case that I talked about, and that was Pat McGuire's case. And like I said, we could have, in last week's episode, we could have tied or put Pat McGuire's case with Carl's, but I feel like they need their own episodes because they're vastly different. As for my personal opinion, I don't know. He had scarring. This is fact here. This little piece right here. He had scarring on his lung. Carl did scarring on his lungs from about with tuberculosis. He also had several kidney stones before he had this experience. So when they bring him to the emergency room and they do these X-rays, his X-rays are clean. Like, there's no scarring on his lungs. All the kidney stones are gone. So if he made it up, he made this whole thing up. If you're a naysayer and you're like, no, they're not abducting us. How the hell do you explain that? That alone leads me to believe that Carl experienced something not of this world. So let us know what you think. Like I said, we will be covering the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblin attack, encounter. I don't know what you call it. News nugget as of today's recording, and today is the 24th of June. Brooks Hawk's trial started today. Hopefully they convict him on the disappearance and what most people unfortunately think happened to Crystal Rogers. He's such a narcissistic maniac. I don't know if he even convicted would tell what had happened. I do know that he was being tried with the other guy in the case. I can't think of his name. What's his name? Lawson. Joseph Lawson. The defense wanted them separated, but the prosecution won that little battle. And also remember, Steve Lawson, Joseph Lawson's son, was tried separately, and he was convicted with a 17-year sentence as an accessory to the disappearance and something else they got him on. But anyway, keep that. If you're into true crime, that's the newest thing right now. Couple of things that I think we had talked about earlier. There's a couple of good true crime documentaries out there. The Gilgo Beach one on Paramount Plus or Peacock, I can't remember. And then also on Hulu, there is that Sick 3 or 4 episode documentary about the Wicked Game. I'm telling you, a disclaimer, that first episode is tough to watch, especially the first 15, 20 minutes. But you talk about another narcissistic maniac, that one's got one in it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with this being the 24th, we'll probably hit you with one more episode before the 4th of July. Again, check out, if you're a patron, check out our What If series exclusive to Patreon. If you want to join Patreon, it's patreon.com/mysteriousbrews. We have a couple of more episodes in the wings of what if we didn't go to the moon and what if the Alcatraz escapees made it, which I really think the brothers made it to South America. So we'll dive into that on Patreon. Let us know if you are a patron and you have a what if that you would like us to tackle. We are more than welcome, or you are more than welcome to drop that in the Patreon comments. You can email us at mysteriousbrews@gmail.com or contact us on our socials. But, ladies and gentlemen, that's about all I got about that. So, deuces.